Hi and welcome back to this mini lecture on the overview of your content. So for your final revision, I'm just going to again mention that I can't cover everything we've covered. So what I've done is really select the main points from each of those weeks and really present those in a short, brief overview. Please use this as a guide for your studying. You might find that some of the content you've read doesn't appear in your lecture notes, but it is still examinable. So let's start with week 3. Week 3, we spoke about planning tools and techniques. So what is planning? Planning is the process of setting objectives and determining how to accomplish them. In doing planning, we set objectives, and the objectives have to be SMART. So we have specific results that we wish to achieve. To do planning, we have 5 sequential action steps that we actually undertake for that systematic planning process. And they include defining your objectives, determining where you stand in relation to those objectives, developing a premise regarding future conditions, analysing and choosing among any of those alternative actions that you've identified, and implement the plan and evaluate. These are really important planning steps. We also learned that there are different types of plans. So there's strategic plans, which are our long-term plans. There's tactical plans, which are developed to implement our strategic plans. And there's those day-to-day operational plans. So there are short-term plans to reach this strategic plan. We also learned about contingency planning, and that's almost saying, what's my backup plan? All right, so what's the alternative courses of action that we can do if our original plan doesn't work? All right, it might be our environmental considerations, or it might be that legal factors are immediately available to us that we weren't before, so we need to do something differently. But what we tend to find is that there's trigger points. And those trigger points really say that what we used to do is no longer available to us. So we need to start doing something else. And that's what contingency plan is. We then talked about scenario planning. And scenario planning was our long-term vision of our contingency planning. All right, so it really said, okay, so plan A is this, but plan B is this. Now let's start thinking through our plan B, and to help us think, we do some scenarios. So if the weather changed in Cairns and all of a sudden we had a cyclone, we couldn't do our normal business. Yes, our normal business. So what we want to do is really start to think about, well, what would be our abnormal business, right? So what's our extra plan, our plan B? This helps us prepare for those shocks that happen. So a manager doesn't get a call saying, hey, there's been a fire in our site up in Wagga Wagga, and as a result, I don't know what to do. They already know what to do. Okay, so we do this in relation to geopolitical changes, terrorism, climate change, sustainable development, human rights and biodiversity as a start. In week 4, we then talked about organising and what we meant by an organisational structure. So we learnt that organising is a process of assigning tasks, allocating resources and arranging activities to implement those plans. It really just clarifies who does what, who's in charge of whom, and what about the different parts and the people in the organisation and the way in which they communicate. All right, so to really communicate what that meant, we used an organisational structure. And the organisational structure is that system of tasks, workflows, working relationships and communication links. All right, so when we change that, we need to then change our organisational design. When we're doing our organisational structures, there are 2 types of structures. There's formal structures and informal structures. So our formal structure is the organisational chart. This is our picture that we show the world that says this is how we're all organised. This is who reports to who, this is the working relationships, and this is how we identify the positions of authority along the way and how people communicate and get things done. All right, so it really is that formal structure of how things are done around here. The other type of structure that exists in organisation is our informal structure. And our informal structure is the shadow of that organisation. So these are the things that aren't actually able to be written. So for example, our receptionist might be the most powerful person in the organisation, yet she sits at the bottom of, or he sits at the bottom of the organisational chart, right? So if we drew this, it would really just show who talks to who, who interacts regularly, where are the cliques in the organisation, how do you navigate through the politics of that organisation. All right, so we start talking about informal learning and how people are actually connecting with each other. And that's really important to have both a formal and an informal structure, because what we'll see is that naturally people will connect with each other, and that will change depending on who's in the organisation at that point in time. We then broke this week down to the different types of structures, and there were advantages and disadvantages of each that we addressed. So there were functional structures, divisional structures, matrix structures, and team-based structures, and they were becoming more and more popular. To create and really design these structures and which one works for that particular organisation given its climate, we use this thing called organisational design. And that's the process of creating structures that best serve a company's mission and objectives. So it takes into consideration things like environment, strategies, people, technology, size, and our goal when we're creating any type of structure is to get the best fit for that organisation. So we ask the questions, well, what culture do you want? What kind of technology are you using? Do you have the capacity to change frequently, or do you need really stable changes happening? And that determines what type of structure best fits that organisation. And when we're talking about designs, we talk about things such as bureaucratic design, mechanistic designs, adaptive designs, and virtual designs, because this will tell us how much flexibility we have. Once we know the type of design, we can then organise the structure. Next week, we focused on control. And control is the management function which refers to all processes that keep the manager up to date with what's happening. All right, so this helps us facilitate necessary ongoing changes. It really talks about, okay, well, if we're not on track, what do we do next? All right, so it helps us measure that performance and helps us decide how to take the next action. So it provides a measure of what's happening. We're able to then check those measurements against some defined objective we did in our planning phase, and then we determine whether the business is on track or not. And if we have those appropriate controls, we're able to really identify, do we have a performance gap? And if so, what are we going to do about it? Okay. To help us do that, we do our control process. And this has 4 steps. Step 1 is to establish the performance objectives and standards. Step 2 is to measure the actual performance. Step 3 is to compare what we're doing now, so our actual performance with our objectives and standards. And then step 4 then becomes take necessary action. In this week, we also spoke about the different types of control. So we talked about bureaucratic control, which is an external control that we put on people. There's clan control, which is really saying, I can influence your behaviour through the norms and expectations that I set in my culture. And there's market control, which is really saying that the competition that exists within our industry will determine what I do and what my members do in my organisation. There are also 3 approaches to designing control systems, and these are different than the control methods that we just mentioned. So these are, sorry about that. These are, there we go, we're back. So these are types of controls, whereas these are approaches to designing the control system. So when we're designing the control system, we're really saying, okay, we've got 3 different types, 3 different approaches that we can look at. We can look at feed-forward controls, and feed-forward controls are the things that happen before we even do any work at all. So they may be minimum qualification standards or certificates that we need to make sure that you're safely able to perform that activity. Concurrent control is where we're really measuring what we're doing as the work is being done. So think about the cooking a chicken in an oven if you're working in a deli in one of the major supermarkets. So in order to make sure that we're not giving our customers food poisoning, we temperature check all the chickens that come out of that oven. And we write that down. And then someone goes through and makes sure that it's above that acceptable standard before it gets put out for distribution. That's a concurrent control. A feedback control is something that we do after we've already done the work in order to get some feedback. So they may be our customer satisfaction surveys that we exist. We also have controls that are internal and external. So our internal controls, so they're the things that are within each of our employees, and they occur through self-discipline and self-control. All right, so we rely on all of our own individuals exercising some self-control over their behaviour. And we touched on this type of control in our motivation lecture as well. We then have external controls, and that can be things that we can control, right? So internal controls are really into our employee, whereas our external controls really occur through our direct supervision and administration systems, all right? So we can take action as a manager to control other people's behaviour. So that was our controlling week. We then moved on to leading, all right? So leading is the ability to inspire effort, to build enthusiasm, communicate the vision, and maintain that momentum within an organisation. In this week, we also discussed power. And power was the ability to get someone to do something that you want them to do, all right? And we have different types of power. So there's positional power, where we can use reward, coercion, or legitimacy, or there's personal power, where we can be considered someone of influence because of our expertise or our referent nature. So they just like us for some reason. We then discussed leadership and empowerment. And empowerment is a process in which managers enable others to gain power and achieve influence throughout the organisation. All right, so effective leaders are those that accept that I need to empower others to do their job. All right, so they do take that step back and say, I trust you to make those decisions, and you can act independently within your areas of expertise and within your areas and boundaries of authority to do the right thing. All right, so empowerment really just allows people to act independently and feel more adult-like in their work environment. So that were the 4 functions of management. We then moved on to our diversity and environment. So in this lecture, we spoke about our specific and general factors that influence us. So our specific factors are things that impact our goals. Okay, so they directly impact the achievement of our goals. And our specific environment will change depending on what our industry is and who we are as a company. So we have unique suppliers, customers, competitors, government agencies, and public pressure groups, depending on who we are and what industry we're in. Our general factors are broad factors, such as political conditions, economic factors, social cultural influences, technology factors, legal, global issues, anything that really directly, indirectly impact the organisation and we can't control. So this is the example that we gave as a specific environment. Okay, so we can have our suppliers, our customers, our labour unions, competitors, our shareholders. We have public interest groups, we have financial institutions, court, educational institutions, federal, state governments, and political parties. And they will all differ on who each of those stakeholders are, depending on who we are as a business. In this week, we also touched on organisational culture. And organisational culture really dictates how people behave in our organisation. So starting with Edgar Schein, who was the father of culture, he defined organisational culture as a system of shared beliefs and values that develop within an organisation and guides the behaviour of its members. All right? So every time you work for a different organisation, there's a different way of doing things around here that you'll hear. Right? And that's called culture. Because our internal culture has the ability to shape attitudes, reinforce common beliefs, direct behaviour, and establish performance expectation and the motivation to fulfil them. It also shapes whether or not people stay or leave in your organisation, how fast-paced things are, what your expectations will be. You can have the same role in 2 different organisations, and yet what you're expected to do are 2 different things. So we get organisational culture from multiple places. We can get them from the founders of the company, we can get them through our stories about our past practices, or we could look at our behaviour of our top management, and that should tell us. Then we moved on to diversity management, and we spoke about the differences in diversity, which is really just any differences we see in an organisation, and the challenges that majority and minority groups have faced. We spoke about minority cultures. We spoke about how there were things like the glass ceiling and the glass cliff. So the glass ceiling is where there's this unofficial limit on where people can go, And what we see within organisations is that minority cultures still permeate through the organisation, but they stop at a certain level. So you might look at an executive team and you might see, it's really interesting that they're all from the same culture, or they're all from the same gender, or they're all from the same stock. So they all went to the school together or the university together or whatnot, and they're all the same. And diversity creates more creativity and innovation if it's appropriately managed. And what we're really trying to get to you is that minority cultures have the ability to really change our mindset and change the way we do things in a great way if it's managed appropriately. So what we tend to find is that our minority groups are the targets of a lack of sensitivity, sexual harassment, culture jokes and discrimination. And yes, we have lots of laws that cover anti-discrimination in the workplace. Sometimes that's not enough. So what we do is we encourage this leadership approach. So we can do three things in diversity to manage it. We can have affirmative action, which is where an organisation comes out in their policies and procedures and says, I commit to hiring and advancing minority groups and women in this workplace. And it's really just the base that organisations can do. We can also have an approach of valuing diversity. And valuing diversity is where we commit the organisation to education and training programs in order to help people understand and respect those differences at a deeper level than they currently do. And our last and most comprehensive approach to diversity is managing diversity. And this is when an organisation gets to this point, it really says that I am committing to changing the culture. And in fact, ultimately, I don't even notice what cultural background or minority group or majority group, there is none within this organisation. We're all equal. So everyone has the ability to reach their full potential. And this is the same information presented in a diagram because some of you really like diagrams. In our international business lecture, we also talked about our forms of international business. Now, there were market entry strategies and direct investment strategies. So organisations will decide whether they just want to put their feet in the water and do some market entry strategies before committing to the direct investment strategy, or they may decide to just jump right in. So if I'm going to do the market entry strategies, these include things like globally sourcing my products, exporting and importing, and licensing and franchising. And we see, particularly in Australia, we see a lot of international companies starting to operate in the Australian market through things such as licensing and franchising or exporting and importing. The direct investment strategy exists when an organisation says, no, you know what, I don't want to just enter it. I want to fully commit to this, and in doing so, I can do it through a joint venture where I have someone in that local culture come and partner with me, or I could jump straight in and just operate my business as a wholly owned subsidiary. In this lecture, we also talked about multinational corporations. And a multinational corporation is a business with extensive operations in more than one foreign culture or country. Transnational corporations are those that operate on a borderless basis. So there's BHP Billiton, PricewaterhouseCoopers, they all exist, but there's not an actual border or a corporate office that they always refer to. They just exist within all countries that they operate in. There's the virtual borderless companies, which is our multinational companies that make use of the internet in order to conduct the business worldwide on a borderless basis. And there's born global companies, which really says that I'm going to go and start my business from scratch on an international market, and that is a different strategy completely. And what we also talked about here was our ethical issues. So we had corruption, sweatshops and child labour as some of our ethical issues for our multinational companies. In week, I want to say 10, we talked about ethics a little bit more, and we'll get to that. However, this was really saying for multinational companies, we need to make decisions around what our corruption acceptability rate is when we're operating in a country that is known to be corrupt, what our sweatshop policy is, and what our child labour policy is. And in order to do that, we can subscribe to an international certificate. So the ISO 14000 is a set of certificate standards that says I'm a responsible environmentalist in this organisation. So sustainable development starts to say, okay, I'm not just thinking about now, I'm thinking about in the future, how do I meet the needs of those present without hurting those future generations that exist? So in week 9, we then moved on to motivation, and we learnt that motivation is the force within us that account for the level, direction and persistence of the work expended. We learnt that there was rewards that we do, and we can assign rewards based on good work, basically. So it's a positive value to that organisation. We've got to work out what that is. So some people are externally driven, some people are internally driven. And that's why there's 2 types of rewards. So there's extrinsic rewards, which is administered externally. So by your supervisors, you give them something tangible for them. And intrinsic rewards are those that employees self-administer. Okay, so they may think, oh, that's really nice that you get to give me that course development. So what I'm going to do is really commit to that. And I feel like that's a great reward that you gave me. We spoke about our theories of motivations, and apologies for these slides. They don't seem to be on screen the same way. But anyway, so in our theories of motivation, they have content theories, which talk about our basic human needs and how people seek out opportunities to meet their needs. There's process theories of motivation, which talked about how people give meaning to those rewards that we give. And then there was the reinforcement theory of motivation, which focused attention on the environment as a major source of a reward. Uh-oh, I did it again. Hang on. Let me just go and fix this for a second. Apologies for that. Slight break. So when we're starting to talk about our theories, we talk about the different types of theories that are underneath our motivation. So just to refresh, there are 3 broad categories of theories of motivation. There's content theories, which focus on human needs, and there's process theories, which focus on how people give meaning to those rewards, and the reinforcement theory focuses on attention on the environment as a source of rewards. So when we're comparing our content theories of Maslow, Adler, Herzberg and McClelland, we find that there are both lower order and higher order needs. In our process theories, they focused on how people understood individual differences in how they were being rewarded. And these were things such as equity-based theory, expectancy theory and goal-setting theory, because all of them were really based on individual preference, availability of those rewards, and the possible work outcome that people perceive. In our reinforcement theory, we started to talk about how our behaviour is influenced by the environmental consequences. So every action has a reaction. All right, the law of effect is saying that behaviour with a pleasant outcome is more likely to be repeated, but behaviour that results in an unpleasant outcome won't be repeated. And we use that information to guide people's behaviour. We use a thing called operant conditioning. Right? So we manipulate the consequences people have in order to change their core behaviour. Right? So there are 4 strategies that we can use. We can use positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishment, or extinction. And we spoke about that. In week 10, we spoke about ethical behaviour. And we specifically looked at the 4 views of ethical behaviour. We learnt that the way people answer ethical dilemmas, which are unknown, they're just morally questionable decisions, are really depends on their view of ethical behaviour. We learnt that those with an individualism view really focuses on their own self-interest. Okay, will it impact me in the long term is that a good thing? The moral rights view, so I'm going this way, starts to ask the questions about, well, does this maintain the fundamental rights of all human beings? The justice view asks the question, well, does a decision or behaviour show fairness and impartiality to everyone, so everyone's going to get the same outcome? Or the utilitarian view asks, well, does the decision or behaviour do the greatest good for the most amount of people? Okay, and that's really important because how we view an ethical dilemma differs based on our worldview. In this week, we also spoke about social responsibility. So corporate social responsibility is the obligation of an organisation to act in ways that serve its own interests as well as the interests of its shareholders. Okay? Organisational stakeholders can really say, corporate social responsibility acts in a way that serves its own interest and the interest of stakeholders, not shareholders. So organisational stakeholders are anyone that affects the behaviour of the organisation. So it could be government, could be competitors, it could be our shareholders, it could be our customers, employees, civil society, suppliers, pressure groups or regulators. And what we talked about in this week was different perspectives. So our classical view of management really said, my job was to run a profit, full stop. Don't care how I do that. This alternative perspective was the socio-economic view. And that held that organisations that must start to be concerned with the broader social welfare beyond just corporate profits. And what we see is this shift of perspectives in organisations today. So some organisations still hold the classical view, whereas others hold the socio-economic view. And then in week 11, we started to talk about leading and managing change. And we spoke about how there were forces of organisational change that existed around that organisation in the environment. So we talked about the global economy, the market competition as being a force, local economic conditions will force us to change things, government laws, regulations, technological developments, market trends and social forces. So here you're seeing that the specific and general environment that exists and operates around our organisation actually act as a force for change. Okay? And in our planning phase, we also talked about this performance gap. So where we are now versus where we want to be, and the gap is in the middle, right? So that will force us to do something about change or an organisation to move it to the next level in order to meet our long-term objectives. So we can do that in a planned change, right? So it's a direct response to our performance gap. Or we can do it in an unplanned change. So this is really saying, okay, something happened in our external environment that now we need to do something about. Right? We didn't plan on it in any way, shape or form, but we need to now move. So that could be a strike, a plant closure, an interpersonal conflict that exists at work. In this lecture, we also spoke about the difference between change leadership and status quo management. So change leadership is somebody who is confident of their ability, they're willing to take risks, they seize opportunities and they expect surprises. So they don't expect everything to work out, but they're okay with that. But they make things happen, okay? So they're the ones that promote and actively support creativity and innovation within an organisation. Whereas the status quo manager will just accept things as is, all right? So they're threatened by change. They're bothered with uncertainty. They like this idea that they go to work, they do stuff, they go home. They don't like unpredictability at all. So they support the status quo, all right? So they wait to see what happens in our change leaders' behaviour before they act, okay? So in a lot of cases, when you're trying to change something, you want to find who your change leaders are rather than your status quo managers, and you want to keep an eye on your status quo managers because they're the ones that are going to be likely to resist. In this lecture, we also spoke about our models of change leadership. So there were top-down change, bottom-up change. So top-down change is where the senior managers in an organisation are enacting something that they want you to do differently, and that's called Theory E change. And bottom-up change is, as it says, it's saying that anyone within an organisation can really empower change within an organisation. It's called Theory O, but it's designed to really increase organisational performance capabilities. All right, so the most successful change leadership style is one that has both top-down and bottom-up meeting together in the middle. Then we spoke about Kurt Lewin, and Kurt Lewin's important because he's the father of change. Every change model comes back down to Kurt Lewin. And Kurt Lewin came back and said, okay, there are 3 phases of our planned change. There's the unfreezing phase where we have to prepare the situation for the change. There's the changing phase where we implement our changes. And there's a refreezing phase where change is stabilised and conditions for its long-term continuity are created. And depending on what we want, there's a different change strategies that we can use. So for example, if we want a fast change, and it has to happen overnight. And we're not expecting it to stay for a long period of time. It's just almost a contingency plan effect. We can use forced coercion. Okay, so as a manager, we can say, okay, I'm going to use my position powers of legitimacy, rewards, and punishment, and we can either directly force you or politically maneuver you through our indirect actions in order to make you do what I want you to do. For a mid-range of both time and how long it's going to last, we can use rational persuasion. All right, so that's really using evidence to argue why it is that you should be moving from one place to the next. And that's using our power base of expertise. And what we tend to find is a lot of information. So you'll see a lot of radio ads, or you'll see a lot of forms and posters in the organisation that's really trying to explain why it's so important for you to change. And then our last change strategy is our shared power. And this is where we're using consultations in order to get what we want. So this is incredibly slow. All right, so we're using our reference point. We're giving people and empowering people to try things and then see how they're going. But it will result in a long-term solution. In every change effort, there will be resistance. All right, now your job as a manager is to perceive that resistance as feedback. So if you see it as a positive thing, then you can act on it much more effectively. So there are multiple approaches to managing resistance, and this includes giving further education and communication, getting them involved, so getting your employees to involve, or even those that resist, get them specifically to be involved as a change agent, or convince them to be. And then you can use facilitation support. You may have to use manipulation and cooptation, or explicit and implicit coercion. But remember back in our motivation lecture where we said that ultimately our positive reinforcement strategies are much more effective than our negative. Granted, sometimes we do need to use our negative approaches such as manipulation, cooptation, or explicit implicit coercion. However, if you can use your positive reinforcement strategies in order to deal with resistance, you're more likely to be successful in the long run. My button just lost. Oh, there we go. All right, so the other type of resistance to change that we spoke about was organisational silence. And that's really a form of resistance where people either fear speaking up, they believe they know best, or they disagree. And what they tend to do is not tell you they disagree because that may be negatively rewarded. All right, so what we tend to do in organisations, we accidentally interpret this as agreement or acceptance, wherein in fact it's actually disagreement. So you do need to make sure that people are on board. All right, so that is your semester or trimester in a nutshell. It is a lot of content, I understand that. However, hopefully this mini video has been a really good guide for you in terms of where we go from here. Thank you.